Hi, folks. We're just letting people in as we speak, so bear with us a second while people filter through. I can see the number clicking up, so positive that we're live. Yeah, thank you so much for coming along today. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to this session, looking into women's experiences of accessing accommodation. We've got a range of speakers from across the country, quite West Yorkshire focused just because of the work that we do, but we've also got Niamh joining us from London. We'll talk a little bit more about who's here and what the session will involve as we move through. I'll just hang on another 30 seconds while people filter through. And may as well get going. So my name's Kat and I'm coming in today from Basis Yorkshire, and we are an organisation based in Leeds who work with women who are sex working to support them in all aspects of their lives. I work as a housing systems change worker, working specifically to improve the systems that may keep a woman in an experience of homelessness. And today we're going to be talking about that really broadly, why it is that women's homelessness is a distinct issue and what it is that we're talking about in terms of best practice, in terms of different options. We've got speakers from all across the system here today. We've got Emilia coming in from the Frontline, some look at commissioning and some strategic work that's been happening. So what I'm hoping is that people can take away suggestions and comments for their managers, for the systems around them to look at improving the situation for women who are experiencing homelessness. I want to go a little bit off-piste before we start today and recognise that this has been a really, really difficult weekend for women, for trans people, for queer people, nationally, internationally, migrants. There's been just what's felt like an onslaught of awful news. And as a frontline worker, it can be difficult to manage your well-being with work while there's all this stuff going on in the background. Back when I was a frontline worker a few years ago, I was lucky enough to go to a talk by Pragna Patel, who was one of the founding members of Southall Black Sisters, who said something that I loved so much that I wrote it down and I keep it on my desk to this day. She said that your boring casework is human rights practice. I wrote it down for myself to remind me that whenever I was there feeling like the day was never going to end, whenever I was just typing in notes and hoping for the best and hoping for the end of the day, that what I was doing was integrating the human rights of women, of people experiencing gender-based abuse, of people facing human rights violations daily. And if there's something that I hope that I can pass on to frontline workers as a little bit of inspiration, is that the work that you're doing is so important for embedding human rights in this country in a time when they're under attack from so many different angles. So thank you. And with that, we will move on to the next slide for a little bit of an overview of what we're talking about today. So as I mentioned, this is a session focusing in on gendered experiences of homelessness. We're going to start with a little bit of chat about why women's homelessness. Why is this something that we're looking at so particularly? We'll then be joined by our first speaker, Emilia, who's joining us from Together Women Project, and she's going to talk about her experience delivering services for women as part of her work with Together Women. We'll then be joined by Lisa Fisher, who's going to be joining us from Leeds City Council to talk about their work delivering gender-informed commissioning. And we're then going to be joined by Niamh, who's coming from London with the connection at St Martin's, who've done work alongside Solace Women's Aid to develop a strategy against women's homelessness. So it's a really packed timetable, but we have left a lot of time for Q&A at the end. So please, if you have any questions, bob those in the chat as we're moving through. I'm really looking forward to hearing from everybody. It's going to be a really packed session. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. I'm going to talk a little bit about what it is that Basis Yorkshire do and why it is that this is such an important thing for me and for my organisation. So Basis, we were never intended as a housing organisation. We are an organisation that supports adult women who sex work and people at risk of sexual exploitation, including young people. And we deliver really broad-ranging support based on harm reduction, based on destigmatising practice, and based on unconditional support. So having no barriers for access to support for women who are sex working in need of any kind of support that you can imagine, basically. Like I say, we deliver really broad ranging support. But what we found over time as we were delivering outreach services and drop-ins for women was that no matter how much effort we put into things like mental health, employment and training, domestic abuse, unless somebody had stable housing, people weren't able to engage in support, weren't able to move through things. Gradually, our work has become much more housing focused in recognition of the fact that housing is such a fundamental right, and that all the other types of work that we're trying to do rely on somebody having stable accommodation. As I mentioned, we do outreach, and we were going out meeting women where they were, meeting women out in the streets where they were sex working. And with that, we were uncovering a whole range of people who were experiencing real acute homelessness, dangerous homelessness, but who weren't being picked up by housing systems, who weren't known to the council or to housing options. People who were staying in situations of hidden homelessness, of real high risk situations, but just weren't being offered support. So with that, I'll move on to the next slide. And I want to talk a little bit about who we're talking about when we talk about women who are experiencing homelessness. With this, I want to acknowledge the fact that I'm not here to say that women's homelessness is worse than any other type. Any form of homelessness, anyone experiencing homelessness is experiencing a rights violation, and it is completely unacceptable. But what we do know is that women experience homelessness differently, that our traditional view of homelessness tends, if we're honest with ourselves, to involve a man sitting on a street corner with a sleeping bag, maybe with a dog, and that those presumptions are embedded within systems. We know that men find it safer to rough sleep in general. That doesn't make rough sleeping a safe experience, but that for women it is much more dangerous. And because of this, women are much less likely to be picked up on street counts. Generally across the country, it tends to be about 1 woman rough sleeping to 7 men. And that these biases are embedded within the systems that then go out to commission services to develop what support is available for people. If we view that women are 1/7 of the homeless population, we develop 1/7 of the supportive services for them. What we know is that women experience homelessness really diversely, and that rough sleeping isn't the be all and end all of women's homelessness. At the point of sleeping rough, at the point where a woman resorts to sleeping rough, her lifetime outcomes tend to be much worse than that of a man in a similar situation. Women who are rough sleeping are more likely to have been without a stable address for a long time, are more likely to have been stuck in a situation of hidden homelessness for a huge amount of time without accessing appropriate support. Women in these situations are more likely to be parents, and they generally have disproportionate experiences of child removal, which we know is such a particular trauma experienced by women. We recognise that women in these situations are more likely to have experiences of trauma more generally, and those are recent and historic, right from childhood through to managing the trauma of homelessness as it happens. Within this, we know that women have almost unanimous experiences of domestic abuse at the point where they're sleeping rough. This was found in a study by Bretherton and Police in 2018 that was done for St Mungo's, interviewing women rough sleepers to find that basically everybody had experiences of rough sleeping either prior to homelessness or as part of their journey managing homelessness. And I think the most stark thing for me is the long-term lifetime outcomes for women who are rough sleeping. We know that this is a combination of mental health and physical health conditions, that people who are sleeping rough in general are much more likely to die from suicide or drug poisoning, and that the overall compounded impact of mental health and physical health conditions on women who are sleeping rough create a really bleak picture for their long-term outcomes. The life expectancy of a woman sleeping rough as of last year was 41. This is as opposed to 83 for the general population. So we know that that's under half the life expectancy of the general population, and that within that, it's one of the very few areas, one of the very few demographics where a woman's life expectancy is lower than a man. In the general population, women live longer than men, but at the point of rough sleeping, that's reversed, and women are much more likely to die younger. This, again, male rough sleepers disproportionately die at younger ages, but that women who are rough sleeping, the long-term outcomes are much less likely to be women are much more likely to be negatively impacted long term, even ending in death. So it's a really bleak picture, and I will move on to the next slide to talk a little bit more about what we talk about when we say without a stable address. So within BASIS, we've recognised that a lot of the women that we're working with have disproportionate experiences of hidden homelessness, that those who are eventually resorting to rough sleeping have been managing as hidden homeless for a long time prior to that. We looked nationally at the definitions of hidden homelessness and kind of found that they didn't really meet what we were trying to describe. We came together as a city within Leeds and we talked about what we mean when we talk about hidden homelessness and agreed on a definition that said we were talking about experiences of homelessness for individuals who either weren't known to or who weren't recognised as being homeless by existing homelessness systems. And this was the big change. There was a lot about people who weren't known to systems, who were hidden from systems, whether they didn't know about the support or didn't know that it was they were eligible for it. But what we found was the gap was people who weren't recognised as being homeless enough. And this was a really common experience for us, that we had people who at certain points had stepped forwards for support, but had been told, well, you haven't been seen rough sleeping, so therefore you can't be as homeless as you're saying you are. People were remaining homeless for years and years because they were told by systems that they weren't at the stage of qualifying for support. We recognise that this homelessness often isn't street visible. That doesn't mean that it never happens on street, but that people are less likely to be picked up by things like street counts because they might avoid common areas, the places that they're more likely to be seen for their own safety. And we recognise that hidden homelessness is more likely to be characterised by a lack of choice or control. So situations like staying with friends or family, often friends or family who might exploit them, exploiters more generally, staying with dealers for women who are sex working, staying with clients overnight, staying in drug houses, really unsafe situations, but just keeping a roof over their heads. What we recognise is that this is a really broad spectrum, that there are situations of hidden homelessness that are actually relatively safe, that are relatively stable. Let's say you're staying with a parent until you get back on your feet. But the longer somebody remains homeless without an intervention, the longer that somebody stays in these situations without a long-term housing option made available to them, that generally there's an increase in precarity and risk, that somebody might be asked to leave by a parent, they need that space back, and they're more likely to rely on less stable situations. They're more likely to be leaning into spaces that aren't positive for them. I want us to really think about that mix of precarity and risk, because this is the situation where we see things turn into really acute forms of homelessness, that people will move between situations with varying levels of precarity and instability and risk. And that when we see people in these really high risk situations, really precarious situations like staying in drug houses, staying with abusers or exploiters, that then we're much more likely to see somebody fall into rough sleeping, often for a night or two before they will return to a risky situation, but that people will move between these situations until eventually they're forced to sleep rough and engage with those real kind of risks associated with that. Quickly, I want to mention repeat homelessness as well, which is something that we recognise is experienced more often by women who are engaging in services that might not be sufficiently trauma informed and able to meet their needs. We've mentioned that services tend to be designed more for men with a traditional view of homelessness, and that women engaging in traditional homelessness systems are more likely to have cyclical experiences of homelessness, that revolving door homelessness, and that this is characterised by unmet support needs, people stepping forward for support, but finding that it doesn't meet their needs, and so leaving hostels if they aren't sufficiently gender informed, getting excluded or evicted if they respond in kind of a highly combative, traumatized way, or short prison sentences where somebody is in prison just long enough to lose a tenancy. So I'll move on to the next slide, which is a quote from one of the women that we worked with as part of a report we did looking into women's experiences of homelessness. He said, it's bad when you're homeless and you're staying with someone because you can't stay for free. So you have to do things that you don't want, like money or sex or drugs. This is that lack of choice or control. This is the situations that people are forced into to continue to manage a roof over their heads without long-term options, and that these become more risky over time. People are more likely to adapt negative coping mechanisms to manage their well-being over time. So we'll move to the next slide. to have a quick look at the system blockages. So we've painted a picture of who experiences homelessness and how that homelessness is experienced. But why is it that women experience these things differently? And why is it that systems aren't set up in the same way? We recognise, as we've touched upon, that funding is often really centralised, that there is a lot of political will around homelessness, and I think Jean touched on this perfectly, but that this is often tied to visible wins, visible things being rough sleeping. If you're walking down a street and you see someone in a sleeping bag, you're more likely to kick up a fuss or have the conversations around that. How do you create political will around something that people can't see? What we find is women in particular ask to be seen sleeping rough and accept that risk before they can access certain streams of support. We know that women are much more likely to present in crisis, that they're more likely to manage their well-being for so long and then engage in services when there is a spike in that risk. What that means is that there's often a short window of opportunity, that there's often 24 hours to make contact with somebody and offer meaningful support. And if it isn't possible during that time, that somebody is more likely to disengage and return to those dangerous, precarious situations. With this, recognising that services are overstretched, particularly frontline workers are really overstretched, and that the onus often ends up, just by merit of the way that systems are set up, relying on being able to make contact with somebody having a stable phone number, being in a certain place at a certain time, which women are less likely to be able to engage in long term. That when a placement is able to be made, those placements are often limited, and they're often in mixed gender environments. They're often just finding a bed, finding something that will work overnight until long-term options can be found. But that women might enter into these situations, find themselves alongside men, which might be re-traumatizing, triggering previous traumas, might even find themselves staying in hostels that are also housing previous abusers or exploiters, and so may disengage from those systems at that stage. We can also recognise that trauma responses can be mishandled, that when somebody is so overstretched and when difficult decisions are having to be made, if somebody is in the middle of a trauma response, which, as we know as frontline workers, isn't always crying quietly in a corner, can be quite aggressive in kind of presentation, that person might be more likely to be excluded, systems might be reluctant to flex, rules might be more likely to be put in place quite firmly, rather than that trauma-informed way that we all hope that we would be working. So I'll move on to the next slide, which I really want to touch on as something central to this, is a really important report looking at a traumatised system. This was done by colleagues at the University of York last year, looking at the housing system in general and the circumstances in which we're all working. And I don't think we can talk about amazing gender-informed change without looking specifically at the system we're working in. Funding loss and funding insecurity has made a really challenging environment for homelessness service providers and commissioners. People are having to make really tough decisions. And so why would people prioritise women's homelessness over the other really acute needs that we're talking about? I'll touch again on Jean's talk earlier, where she was talking about prevention and upstream prevention being really vital. When we're talking about this, we're talking about fixing problems before they become really, really acute, and that is a long-term saving overall. It's really hard for the systems to see that at the time because it's all about those quick wins and those quick money savings. But if we can build in upstream prevention into homelessness systems, particularly those supporting women early on, that is a cost-saving measure and a trauma-saving measure overall. So we'll move on to the next slide, which is my final slide, which is a very quick look at what works. And I won't kind of bore you with the details because we're going to be moving on to some speakers who are going to be outlining this much better than I can. But again, we've touched on upstream prevention as a way of solving women's homelessness, accessing people before they're on the street and trying to engage people in services at a stage earlier than systems are traditionally set up for. Joint working, and this is the theme of the day, but kind of the core of what I want to communicate today, is people working across systems, and that's the system more generally, not just homelessness, but also domestic abuse, social services, food banks, looking at information sharing agreements and sharing support for people, particularly shared support plans. In Leeds, we're trialling Team Around Me, which was developed by our colleagues over at Fulfilling Lives Islington and Camden, which is a way of bringing women into their own support planning procedures, developing support plans that involve all the workers around that person to make sure everybody's on the same page and everyone's working towards the same goals. Reducing repetition, making sure that women don't have to keep telling their stories again and again and going through that trauma again and again. gender and trauma-informed practice, which I don't think you can talk about separately. I think those are two sides of the same coin. Trauma-informed commissioning, which Lisa's going to be talking about in more detail. Services by women for women, services that are developed with women's needs specifically in mind. And then quickly a look at systems change. I'm incredibly privileged in that my job is systems change. I'm a systems change worker. And again, as Jean mentioned, systems change is something that brings people together, sharing agendas and developing the links between organisations. I think to make this work, it has to be somebody's job. It has to be somebody who has the time dedicated rather than trying to manage a million things alongside systems change. It needs to be something that an organisation can dedicate time to. So if there's a recommendation that I can take from my work for you to badger managers around, it's developing roles around systems change so that you can have the time to build relationships with other organisations, with commissioners, with strategists, to help push towards a common goal and make long-term changes that are impactful and sustainable. So with that, I will stop talking and I will pass across to Emilia, who is going to be talking in more detail about her work with Together Women project. So thank you.
Thank you, Kat. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Emilia, and I will be talking to you today about some of the barriers that women face to accessing safe and suitable accommodation from a frontline perspective. Next slide, please. This session is going to focus on temporary and supported accommodation, as these are the two main types of accommodation that's offered to homeless women, especially when they're leaving prison. And I'm going to be discussing what I have found to be the two main barriers of accessing accommodation, which are accessing safe and suitable accommodation and the availability of accommodation. Next slide, please. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about my role then and what I do. So I currently work as a custody accommodation key worker based at HMP Newhall for Together Women. HMP Newhall is a closed female prison in Wakefield that has around 400 women who are predominantly from the Yorkshire and Humberside area. My role is centred around supporting women who have a range of different housing needs, but mainly those who will be released homeless from prison to the West Yorkshire area. My role originated last year with the introduction to the new Unified Probation Systems Dynamic Framework, and my referrals come through the Centralised Rehabilitative System known as the CRS. And once I receive a referral, I have a conversation with a woman to identify her housing support needs and then make referrals to the local authority, housing providers and support services. And I can also support them to access the social housing register whilst they're in custody, as well as maintaining their tenancy if they're sentenced for a long period of time. So that's kind of what I do. There's more in and around all of that, but that's the general gist of my role. And so I provide this support with Together Women, and Together Women have had a presence at Newhall since 2009, and we're fortunate enough to have the only women's centre in prisons in the UK, which was established in 2012. Next slide, please. So who are Together Women and what do we do? Together Women was established in 2006 as one of the MOJ pilot demonstration projects and has been a national trailblazer for developing gender-specific and trauma-informed services for women and girls involved in the justice system across Yorkshire and the Humber. We've got women's centres in Leeds, Bradford, Sheffield and Hull, and we've got hub provisions in Kirklees, Coaldale and Wakefield, where we offer groups, training, workshops and one-to-one support across 8 main pathways, which include things like accommodation, family and significant others, and education, training and employment. The majority of the women that we work with are involved in the criminal justice system and are on probation supervision, both in the community and within custody also. And at New Hall, we've got 10 staff members who support with housing, counselling, ISFA, IDFA, sex work, VOG, MAS and community links. So overall, we've got many teams covering a really large area and supporting women on a variety of different issues. Next slide, please. So when we think about what accommodation is appropriate for women, we really need to be assessing women as individuals independent from one another. A large proportion of women, especially those involved in the criminal justice system, have experienced and continue to experience a variety of adverse life experiences. And though some men experience these also, it is undeniable that most, if not all of these issues are disproportionately experienced by women. Some of these can include domestic violence, sexual violence, child sexual exploitation, menopause, child removal, poverty, substance misuse, mental and physical health issues. And therefore, it's important that there are accommodation options available for women that are both gender specific, meaning that they take into consideration the specific needs that women have, and also trauma informed, so take into account the potential trauma that women have or still are experiencing. But unfortunately, a lot of the options that are available have been created by men for men and are not safe or suitable for women. Next slide, please. So what do we mean then by safe and suitable accommodation? What do these terms actually mean? Safe accommodation keeps the individual free from risk and harm. A great example of this could be domestic abuse, a refuge for those who are experiencing domestic abuse, which often offers surveillanced and staffed accommodation in a different area, away from where the perpetrator knows they are. Another example could be staffed or self-contained female-only accommodation for those with substance misuse issues to avoid the risk of being targeted by dealers or abused and assaulted whilst they're under the influence. Suitable accommodation then is based on the individual needs. So each woman has a different set of needs. Some will benefit more from independent living circumstances, whereas some of them will be benefiting more from intensive support. So it's really important that the level of support is relative to the individual needs of a woman. Next slide, please. And unfortunately, the temporary and supported accommodation offers tend to be mixed gendered, hostels or shared houses with very limited support, and these are not appropriate for women who have complex needs. And another barrier to accessing accommodation for women is the limited amount of bed spaces that are available. Currently, we've got really, really long waiting lists, and a lot of housing providers will not hold bed spaces for people until the day that it's actually needed. And this causes a lot of issues for when you're trying to source accommodation for women when they're leaving prison. Most housing providers are attached to the local authority and operate through a single point of contact access system. So all referrals have to go through one pathway. And although this can be really useful, it makes it difficult for housing support workers like myself who are trying to make direct referrals to housing providers, and also in order to get updates on the progress of the referrals that you have made. And since the system is dominated by male applicants, most of the spaces available inevitably do go to men. Most providers and local authorities will also not accept applicants who do not have a local connection to the area. And this makes it really difficult for certain people who may need to leave an area for their safety or for a fresh start to access accommodation. Next slide, please. So although there are many barriers to accessing safe and suitable accommodation, there are a few examples of projects that have done really, really well to understanding the needs of women and creating effective, safe and suitable accommodation. The community cabin is a project that started in November 2019, and I work really closely with the directors of this organisation who take referrals directly from myself through the prison. They tend to come into Newhall to meet the women before they're released, to build a rapport and to identify their support needs. If the assessment is successful, they will then offer them a gate pickup on release from prison, on the day's support to attend appointments, and also continued intensive wraparound support. The properties are fully kitted out to a high spec with some en-suites and an all-female house. So all the women need to bring is themselves and their clothing, which is great. And another really good aspect of the community cabin is that they accept people with no local connection to Castleford or Wakefield, which means that people who need to leave their area for whatever reason are able to access appropriate supported accommodation. Another example of a project that's done really well, which has recently just come out of its initiation phase, is Somewhere Safe to Live, which is by Together Women Foundation and Leeds City Council. So Foundation managed the tenancies whilst Leeds City Council managed the referrals, and then Together Women offer the wraparound support. It is a move on accommodation from Somewhere Safe to Stay, which is an emergency and temporary accommodation offer for women in Leeds. And at the moment, with a move on accommodation being so scarce, it's really great to have projects like this popping up. And hopefully in the future, we can see more to continue to develop. Next slide, please. So thank you for listening to me today. I really hope that you found the contents of my session interesting. Please leave your questions in the Q&A to answer at the end. I've added my email address there and the link to Together Women's website if you want to ask any further questions ahead of this meeting. And then if you just want to have a little look into what our organisation does. So yeah, thank you. I'm going to pass over to Lisa now.
Thanks, Emilia. So my name is Lisa Fisher. I work for Leeds City Council Commissioning, and I just want to talk to you about who I am, what we do in commissioning, and about our journey in commissioning gender-informed services in Leeds. Next slide, please. So firstly, a little bit about me. I've worked in homelessness for 17 years, 14 of which was on the front line, directly supporting homeless people. I've been lucky to experience working for both the voluntary and the statutory sector, and I've been paid across organisations. But for the last 4 years, I've worked as the Senior Commissioning Officer for Leeds City Council Adults and Health Commissioning. I'm proud to work for Leeds Local Authority, and at the heart of what we do is tackling poverty, inequality, whilst aiming to improve the quality of life for everyone. And one of our core council values is #TeamLeads, which is fitting for today's theme of working together. We all know integral to any success is to work as a team. No one organisation has the solution, and it's only by providing as much as we can under one roof that the people that we support will be able to move on positively in their lives. We all know homelessness is not a housing issue alone, and we need a multidisciplinary team to respond to need. Next slide, please. So often is the case when I'm attending national events that many are pleasantly surprised by what we do in commissioning and the great relationships that we have with our providers. So when I was asked to give this presentation, I wanted to highlight some of the small ways in which we work that seems to be the catalyst in influencing change at a service level. So the commissioning cycle sits at the heart of what we do, and our main responsibilities are to review and procure services, bid for additional funding, implement new services, and to contract manage the services that we procure in order to make sure that they are quality and achieving outcomes for vulnerable people in our city. We're continuously reviewing our provision, and we assess the growing need and demand in our city to make sure that we are procuring services where they are needed the most. We've got 25 people in our team, all with varying skills and experience. Some of our staff have lived experience, some have worked on the front line, and many of us have had experience of working within the communities and the services that we support. We collaborate with each other and we share key themes and messages, which has allowed us to identify common issues and barriers and gaps in service provision. One example brought various council departments and third sector providers together within a task and finish group to work through to tackle evictions and restrictions amongst our accommodation-based services. So this involved looking at things from a gender-specific point of view as well, and resulted in creating a memorandum of understanding that has meant that we've got much fewer evictions and more time-appropriate evictions from accommodation now. In terms of meetings, we've played a key role in setting up multi-agency tasking meetings that bring a wide range of partners together to help support services that are set up on the back of short-term funding. Something that we've extended from the learning in the pandemic was that collaboration ensures the best chance of success. Therefore, having a reactive police response, links with antisocial behaviour teams, co-location of support services, tends to limit the challenges that the providers face when we are embedding into what can often be a one-year pilot. Our commissioning team worked with providers and other directorates within the council to streamline a number of meetings to create the MASP, which stands for Multi-Agency Solutions Panel. The MASP brings together a range of agencies, both voluntary and statutory, to discuss and share information with the aim of reducing risk and increasing safety for adults who have high levels of complexity and multiple needs. Agencies work collaboratively to promote sustainable positive outcomes for individuals through considering how their services can bend and flex to meet the needs of each person. The meetings in Leeds are often attended or chaired by members of our commissioning team, so we do have an active role and provide a listening ear at all levels. The staff in our team, they regularly attend forums, networks and conferences, including the Frontline network held here in Leeds. And this is particularly successful in feeding back to our wider commissioning where there's gaps in training, knowledge or services available in the city, and we've been able to act on this. Communication is absolutely key, so we make sure that we've got regular communication with our providers that stretch beyond the quarterly contract meetings. This makes them feel supported, involved in decision making, but it allows us to have that honest conversation around check and challenge. We visit our services on a regular basis and we see firsthand what our providers are dealing with. We take opportunities to meet the clients supported by our service, we shout about the good news stories and we share the good practice. It is vital that we give regular updates around funding streams and new services coming on board with all of our partners wherever possible, and we encourage services to co-locate, ensure that everyone is learning from each other every day. Rather than auditing our services yearly, we develop the quality management framework tool for providers, which allows them to self-reflect and assess their own service, which gives them ownership for identifying their own gaps in the service and provides them with a tool for developing strategies to overcome them. Consultation and learning, we are renowned for. We hold regular consultations around planning services, service delivery, taking on board suggestions of how things should change, and where possible, we consult with independent bodies such as Homeless Link. Just to reflect on this point then and bring to life some examples of how we began our female provision in Leeds as a result of consultation. So in the years leading up to 2019, we entered into conversations with our gender-specific services, namely Basis and Joanna, around women not being recognised in the definition of rough sleeping. We listened to concerns that were raised that women would often remain in dangerous situations, not feeling able or comfortable to approach as homeless, as the provision that we had available was mixed, shared and male-dominated. So in commissioning, we do try and aim to get a good evidence base, but the statistics at the time were not readily available or were not true of the actual need. Numbers of women that we were finding on head counts were only 5 at the highest, but Basis and Joanna were able to tell us that there were around 30 women that they were working with at the time that met that wider definition of homelessness. So the opportunity arose in 2019 when the Department of Levelling Up, Housing and Communities released the Rapid Rehousing Pathway Funds, and we were the only city to submit a bid for women-only accommodation. The service initially was to provide 5 overnight beds in a shared environment for up to 72 hours and support from female-only staff. And as you can imagine, we were met with a number of challenges in this accommodation. It was shared, it was limited to only 5 beds, it was only accessible in the evening. So we would often lose clients in between referrals being made, and there was a lack of opportunity to provide intensive support to the women. The provision was closed at the start of the pandemic, and we were the only city to set up female-only hotel accommodation. Provision increased, it was self-contained, it had 24/7 support on site and a range of support organisations, which proved really successful. Coming out of the pandemic with this learning, and we took the opportunity to conduct further consultation exercises, this time with various audiences. This allowed us to take into account the needs and the direct quotes of the women that were accessing our services, frontline practitioners, stakeholders, third sector organisations, along with other local authorities across the core cities, to make sure that we were learning and building on the success and implementing change in our offer. One of the gaps that were identified through the consultation was the number of women that we had difficulty rehousing with arson convictions. So we made sure that this featured in our plans for the new female-only accommodation provision at the Somewhere Safe to Stay, and this now includes a misting system. We've been successful further in another bid for funding to provide 15 one-bedroom self-contained flats to let to women who are ready to move on from the Somewhere Safe to Stay emergency provision into a dispersed unit in the community on a 2-year lease. This is the Somewhere Safe to Live that Emilia mentioned, and it's now mobilised, and it will help us with that move on accommodation. The allocations for the female housing pathway I've described is discussed as a multi-agency approach, with many of our core services attending fortnightly meetings to look at move on plans and packages of support being put in place for the women. Next slide, please. So commissioning gender informed services. Next slide, please. So here I just wanted to list a number of gender specific services that we've got in the city. Not all of these are commissioned by us. Top 2 lines here are offering gender specific accommodation for women. So as you can see, we're quite lucky to have a number of female only housing services that vary in offering emergency, supported and long-term accommodation that provide intensive support. Within this list, we've got schemes that are specialists for women fleeing domestic abuse, women who are alcohol dependent, and women with complex needs. The second 2 lines here cover support organisations that provide countless interventions for women requiring support, from BAME communities to sex workers, to honour-based abuse, criminal justice, and so on. Within the last line on this slide, I just want to tell you about some new ventures that we started recently. So in 2021-22, we received 1.8 million DULUP funding to support victims and survivors of domestic abuse in Leeds. And for this, we focused on 3 areas, which was firstly, enhancing the support offer that we had in the existing specialist domestic abuse accommodation. So more specialists around young people, workers, mental health, counselling, therapy and out of hours. We developed the sanctuary support scheme to make sure that people who would rather stay in their own homes had access to ongoing support. And thirdly, we provided funding for other housing support services, such as Beacon, Our Way Leeds, Somewhere Safe to Stay and Basis, so that they had specialist domestic abuse practitioners as part of their staff team. And this, we know that not all victims and survivors of domestic abuse are housed in the specialist domestic abuse emergency accommodation. So all these services all support large numbers of victims and survivors. So it was a priority for us to get this in place. We've been awarded a similar amount of funding for next year, and the intention is to continue funding what I've described. And in addition to this, we're going to make sure that victims and survivors' voices are part of the development of future strategy and commissioning. And we intend to develop a domestic abuse practitioner network. Also lucky to have the new Boobadal pilot here in Leeds, which began in November 2021 to offer 13 female sex workers to tackle opiate addiction. This is great in helping women who fall on and off their scripts, as it reduces the need for them to attend the pharmacy regularly. We've got a multi-agency panel discussing referrals. It has been a bit of a slow uptake, 5 currently on the programme, so they have looked at the barriers that the women face, which has been around fear and anxiety really, and to try and break those down. 4 that are on this medication are now heroin free. 3 out of 4 are no longer sex working. None of the women have been arrested. All are in multi-agency support, and 1 person has reconnected with her family and is going on holiday. And we're also pleased to announce that one of our visions for Leeds is to have a purpose-built health and wellbeing centre for homeless people and rough sleepers. This is about to become reality. Bevan Healthcare are partnering with St Anne's Community Services to renovate an existing city centre location, one in which we've decided we'll have separate entrances for females. Next slide, please. So what are we doing that will help tackle some of the issues that have been highlighted within Kat's presentation around systems change? We are about to publish our new homelessness and rough sleeping strategy. This year we've changed our approach to the strategy. The strategy was co-produced and it was done in collaboration with our partners. We want everyone to buy into it, and we want everyone to be accountable for taking the steps to achieving it. Another thing we're doing next month is formalising a document around the female housing pathway. We will continue to attend the West Yorkshire Co-Commissioning Group, which is looking to support, streamline and provide consistency in the commissioning of female-only services across West Yorkshire. And we are working on establishing a Leeds VAG board in preparation for the West Yorkshire Mayor's strategy launching later this year. So to help us prepare for that, we've been doing some analysis of the national strategy in the meantime and what's currently being delivered in Leeds against that. And of course, we will continue to learn as we go, remodelling and developing our services to meet the changing need and demand in our city. And we will keep feeding back to central government around the challenges that we're facing. As always, we will put the views of the women that we support in our city at the heart of what we do. Thanks for listening. And last slide, I just want to leave up a poem that that one of our clients had written, one of the residents from the Somewhere Safe to Stay. She did move on successfully, but she didn't give our staff an easy ride in her time in the accommodation. So that's all from me. Thanks.
Hi everyone, so my name's Niamh and I'm the Best Practice Coordinator of the Women's Development Unit, and I'm going to do a little presentation around what work we've done around addressing women's homelessness on a strategic level. So next slide please. So the Women's Development Unit is a partnership project between the Connection at St Martin's and Solace Women's Aid, and it's set up to bring strategic attention to women's homelessness in London. So for those who are not familiar with London services, the Connection at St Martin's is a homelessness charity based in Westminster that offers accommodation and casework support to help people recover from periods of homelessness. And Solace Women's Aid are an organisation that work with women and children who are impacted by gender-based violence in London. We were created in February 2021, and the aims were to create and embed a strategy to address women's homelessness in London, particularly focusing on women who are experiencing multiple disadvantages, to improve outcomes for women experiencing homelessness, to explore and develop best practice, to amplify the voices of women with lived experience, and to encourage collaboration between the women's specialist and homelessness sector, recognising the expertise that exists within both of those sectors. Next slide, please. Really, the unit was created in partnership with both organisations out of the growing recognition that men and women experience homelessness differently, and that both, and Kat talked about that earlier, both in terms of routes into homelessness and their experiences during homelessness as well. And whilst that there was a lot of recognition of that on a frontline level, and for those working within homelessness, that recognition is not reflected in policies, in strategies, in wider service delivery, funding and data around homelessness in general. We tend to see it as quite a male problem, particularly when we're looking and focusing on rough sleeping. So generally, the assumption is that policies and services are gender neutral, they're open to everyone, they apply to everyone who's experiencing homelessness. But in reality, actually, what we find is homelessness services are predominantly male spaces, and policies to address rough sleeping are designed around men's experiences. What then happens is that women's needs and experiences can be overlooked, they can be unaddressed, and then the additional risks that they face and difficulties are often overlooked entirely within service delivery, but also in policy. It means then actually women are left in cycles of homelessness, at increased risk of gender-based violence, and not getting the help and support that they need. So really the two organisations came together out of that recognition and wanted to do something about this on a larger scale. Next slide, please. So for our first year, our main aim was to develop a pan-ending women's homelessness strategy. And what we did in order to do that is we consulted with a wide range of stakeholders from various areas. So the VORG and women's specialist services, also the homelessness sector. We consulted with local authorities, with the Greater London Authority, London Council, and also the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. In particular, we also were keen to hear from women with lived experience as well and incorporate their views on what the difficulties and barriers they faced were, but also how to overcome these and provide services that are actually effective and gender informed. So we consulted with these stakeholders in a variety of ways. We carried out one-to-one interviews, we did surveys, we did meetings, focus groups, workshops, but we also looked at the existing literature around women's homelessness as well. So also recognising that actually a lot of services, particularly in the homelessness sector, have sought to gain a greater understanding of the difficulties and needs of their female clients, and have produced really excellent in-depth overviews in terms of those difficulties and needs and experiences. So much of the understanding is out there already. There's been a lot of really positive work. So bringing all of that together, though, a lot of these things are produced and then they're sort of siloed and not many people are aware of them. So bringing together and making sure that there was a platform to promote that work as well. We also worked alongside practitioners throughout the year, so to talk to them about the barriers that they faced in achieving positive outcomes for their clients, also looking at their training needs and what they found difficult to deal with themselves. And at the same time, we piloted a women's drop-in space at the Connection at St Martin's as well, and that was really helpful to inform our learning and our practice over the year. So our findings have now been translated into a strategy and also an accompanying evidence report, which kind of sets out all the overarching themes, the barriers, the gaps, but also the recommendations, the solutions and the actions that we think are necessary to address these barriers and difficulties and improve access for women. Next slide, please. And again, Kat talked earlier about the differences in terms of additional risks that women face whilst homeless. And some of these are reflected in our key findings as well. So one of the really important things to note was that women often stated that they didn't think that homelessness services were safe spaces for them. So that was particularly in terms of accommodation, which is what we're discussing today, but also just facing barriers to actually accessing any sort of advice or support services at all when homeless. So traditional homelessness services like day centres or hostels and things like that, women were often reporting not only were they finding those spaces intimidating and difficult to access, but also they were reporting high levels of sexual harassment, abuse and violence within those spaces as well. I think it's something that's really key that we kind of highlight. I think there's greater understanding around the links between domestic abuse and homelessness. And obviously that is a really key area that needs to be addressed, but also risks around sexual violence and abuse whilst homeless, whilst it is particularly rough sleeping, is a really key issue for women and something that often is difficult for them to disclose and discuss with services, particularly when those services are male dominated and quite chaotic spaces. So we also found that generally there was a poor assessment of the needs of women within services. So again, that assumption that these kind of gender neutral or one size fits all approaches would be suitable to addressing the needs and supporting women, where in actual fact they're not. But also increased stigma of women as well who are experiencing homelessness and multiple disadvantage. So stakeholders, but women themselves talked about feeling stigmatized by services who were judgmental around their experiences of child removal, their experiences of domestic abuse, mental health, and generally stepping outside of those kind of traditional female roles. They found that increased stigma, and professionals reflected that as well sometimes in how they spoke about women being quite difficult or complex or hard to reach, hard to engage, etc. Another really key aspect, and again, people have touched on it today, is the lack of data around women's homelessness. So Kat spoke about the notion of hidden homelessness and how we categorise homelessness at the moment in terms of statutory homelessness or rough sleeping. And there's a huge section in between all of that where people might be in different situations that are very risky and dangerous and expose them to exploitation that aren't actually recorded, or we have no way of measuring at the moment. So things like where people are exchanging sex for accommodation, where people are staying with partners or otherwise people who put them at risk, but also how women actually experience rough sleeping. So it might be around hiding from services, it might be around walking around all night, it might be cyclical and doing that for a couple of nights and then finding somewhere to stay and then going back to rough sleeping. What we have at the moment are systems that don't actually capture that. And then when we look at sort of standard rough sleeping counts, actually they don't reflect the real number of women that are actually street homeless or at risk of street homelessness. What that then means is they continue to remain invisible in policy, and particularly in terms of funding and allocating services to women's specific services. So if we're not actually capturing the true scale of the issue, then it's harder then to advocate for specific services and funding for women. So it's a really, really key issue. That's the negative stuff. We did also find some positives in the sense that there was a strong consensus around what the issues were, and that's really important, that actually practitioners, commissioners, the stakeholders were quite clear that understanding was there, and it also in terms of what actually needed to change or what could change to make that better. And there was a strong drive as well to translate this into positive change, which is really, really key. Next slide, please. So in terms of our strategy, our recommendations are quite broad and wide-ranging, but we recommend that a gender-informed approach should be adopted at all levels. So policymakers, funding commissioners, all of that, it needs to incorporate the needs and experiences of women and reflect the fact that our current ways of measuring homelessness are not adequate. We've also recommended that we develop and expand cross-sector strategic groups, creating joint strategies and policies. So we recognise, obviously, when we're dealing and supporting people who have complex needs, that actually those needs intersect different areas, and one sector alone cannot address all of those issues and cannot provide effective support. We need to be working together, and particularly around the issue of child removal and the fact that many women who have experienced homelessness have experiences of that is a really good example of where that intersects into different sectors such as children's services, and looking at how we need to bring those policies and strategies together to address that rather than kind of working in silos. We've also talked about gender-informed data collection to provide a more accurate and nuanced picture of women's homelessness, and we'll talk about that a little bit further on in terms of the work that we're doing in our second year to achieve that. We talked about needing an adequate range of suitable and safe women-only accommodation, appropriate for level of need and available for immediate access. We recognise that there is insufficient amounts of women-only accommodation in London. We also recognise that when we look at refuge accommodation, often women with multiple disadvantage or substance misuse or severe mental health issues are often not able to access that support. So while we might think there's specific women's provision available, actually that's not available to most women that we're working with who've experienced rough sleeping and homelessness. But also refuge provision is at capacity and routinely is turning people away due to a lack of capacity. So we must recognise that actually there's a gap there that does need to be addressed and filled. Can I get the next slide, please? Whilst we do advocate for women-only accommodation, we also recognise that's not going to be the answer for all women, and not all women want women-only accommodation. but we must respond to the consistent feedback from women that they do not feel safe in mixed sex accommodation. And again, as I spoke about, that relates often to experiences of gender-based violence, and that actually, if this is going on within our services, we need to really be sitting up and taking some action around that, and making sure that those services are safe for them. We advocate for multi-agency service provision, again, recognising that bringing together people with different expertise is really key and important for unlocking and breaking through those barriers. We also talk about facilitating women's access to accurate and safe advice and support. So again, looking at where are we taking that support to women, where are they likely to access and feel safe to do so, but also making sure that we're not just stating, well, we've created this service and it's here if they want it, whilst they're saying they don't feel safe or they wouldn't access the service. We also advocate for wraparound and ongoing trauma-informed support. So recognising that just because somebody has accommodation and maybe that's for 3 months, that's problem solved and case closed, that actually that person's homelessness is not resolved, it's temporarily resolved. And there may be multiple issues, and again, referring back to women's perceptions of safety within services. So making sure that people are supported throughout their journeys to get to a place of stability and recovery, and that actually the continuous kind of endings and difficulties around starting up new relationships with new workers in new projects and new accommodation spaces is really, really difficult for women, particularly women who've experienced trauma and disrupted attachments with people throughout their lives. So actually that really needs to change as well, that kind of model of support that's attached to an accommodation provider only, and that ends if that accommodation placement breaks down. And we also advocate for special support and advocacy for mothers who have experienced child removal. So regardless of the circumstances and regardless of whether the parents are likely to be reunited with their children at any point, actually this is a real gap where many women experience child removal, and that actually that sets off a series of events that ultimately ends in homelessness for some of them and losing accommodation. It's a really complex and difficult area, but actually that support is not available as standard currently, and we think that really needs to change. Next slide, please. So having developed the strategy, in our second year, our focus has now shifted to supporting organisations and policymakers and commissioners to adopt and embed the strategy. So what we don't want to do is just create another report that highlights all the issues and that's job done. We want to actually see some tangible changes out of this. So one of the ways in which we're doing that is we are working with Life Off the Streets, which is a body that has strategic oversight of strategic initiatives to address rough sleeping across London, because there are quite a few different ones. So it kind of brings together all those different bodies that are working in that area. They have created an ending and preventing women's rough sleeping subgroup, which has adopted our strategy and has identified key priority areas and established working groups to actually address these and get these things implemented and working. Some of that is around data. So we know that data is an issue. One of the things that we want to do is over the summer develop, design and carry out a women's count across London. So we know that traditional rough sleeping counts don't capture women. So what we want to do is take all the learning that we've got over the last year and wider and put that together to create a census that would actually capture or be better able to capture the true nature of women's rough sleeping in London. And we want to do that across the capital. So what that would then help us to do is to advocate for the need for funding. We routinely see that in street counts in London, generally women are about a fifth of people who are identified visibly rough sleeping. In services, though, they tend to make up about a third. So we can see there is that gap there. But because funding tends to run from official rough sleeping counts, there's obviously that gap there that needs to change. But also about challenging that conceptualization of rough sleeping, visibly rough sleeping in a doorway being the only form of street homelessness that people can experience. We're also working with organisations to become more gender informed and remove the barriers women face to accessing services. So that can be a range of things, whether it's looking at doing gender informed reviews of services, or whether it's services who want to create women only services and want some help and support around that. And also raising the profile of women's homelessness in public spheres spheres, including bringing it to the attention of MPs and cross-party groups. I think it is important to note we often talk about commissioners as if they have magic wands and endless funds, and recognising that the barriers that commissioners face to implementing gender-informed best practice, and that actually the influencing and campaigning needs to go up higher so that they're actually enabled to do that work as well. Next slide, please. So just to say, because of the theme of today is working together, just how we got here and what actually worked well and what enabled us to do this. And people have talked today about some examples of really good practice in different areas of the country as well. But identifying what's working well as well as what needs to change. So obviously there is difficulties, there is barriers, there are things that need to change. But actually across the country, there's pockets of really, really good practice going on. And there are people who have pioneered this and are innovating in really successful ways. And one of the things we wanted to do is raise and influence and campaign around looking at those examples of best practice and highlighting them. So it's not just that this is all really problematic and difficult, there are ways that we can address and improve and support, and evidencing those as alongside discussing the barriers and difficulties. We also really key to do stakeholder mapping and looking at who actually holds power to unlock this stuff. And sometimes that's not always where we think it is, but also looking at where is the understanding as well. So you might have people who have a really good understanding and really passionate and enthusiastic about making change, but actually they hold little power in their day-to-day role. So looking at actually who is it that needs to be communicated with and challenged and have those conceptualizations discussed and influenced around that to actually affect change. Co-production is really key. So again, and I've also put evidence-based there. So there is a lot of evidence that we can draw upon, and it is important that we are evidence-based in what we're discussing, what we're advocating. But sometimes some of the most powerful things is to have the voices of lived experience in the room and talking about this was my experience, and at this point this would have helped, and at this point this was awful, and that's why this happened. And you know, actually really hearing from people what would help and what could change things is so key. Also really key is bringing together people with different expertise to collaboratively problem solve. I think this is a really key one, in that problems that seem really knotty and really difficult on our own, actually when we bring together people from different areas and different specialisms, actually sometimes that's quite easy to unravel collectively in a way that would be impossible on our own. And I can't overemphasize the importance of working together cross-sector on a multi-agency level to really impact change. Also solution focused. So again, it goes without saying, you don't want to just highlight the problem, but what can we actually do about it? And in terms of influencing and campaigning around this, if we're solution focused, if we've got ideas, if we're able to put forward things that would make a tangible difference, people are more likely to listen to that than just setting out what the problem is. I've also put collective voice. So again, like bringing together the homelessness and VOG sector is really key. But wider, we want to have a wider collective voice than that. But again, it's much harder to disagree or challenge this stuff if actually we're all singing from the same hymn sheet. And I think sometimes we can get very bogged down into what our organisation is doing or highlighting that, whereas actually we're working with quite complex social issues, and to bring it back to look at this collectively and say, actually, you know, and if we're all singing from that same hymn sheet, it's much more powerful than just doing it on an individual organisational level. And challenging prevalent narratives and conceptualization. So like I said, in terms of women's homelessness in particular, we really need to be looking at that gap around hidden homelessness and the ways that their homelessness and experiences of homelessness play out, rather than looking at the kind of, or trying to fit them into the boxes we have already established. We need to really tackle that. And I think much of the work around women's homelessness will come from challenging and breaking down those kind of boxes which aren't working for them at the moment. And obviously time and resources. So again, I'm lucky enough to have a role where this is the focus. A lot of people have a lot of passion around this and a lot of really good ideas, but actually are bogged down in the day-to-day and don't have the capacity to do so. So again, actually resourcing roles and teams to address this is what's going to move it forward, rather than people doing piecemeal bits and bobs as and when they can, which is really challenging. So yeah. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to finish up just to say you'll get these slides after today's session, and you'll be able to access the strategy, the evidence report, and also guidance around women's spaces within homelessness settings as well. So just to say you can access those. I will stop talking now, and we'll go through a Q&A. But if you want to contact me about any of this work, my email address is there, and I'm happy for people to get in contact directly. But thank you for listening.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Niamh. And we're going to be coming back together for a Q&A. We've got 20 minutes for questions. So please, if there's anything that you would like to ask to any of our panelists, pop it in the chat. I'll take this opportunity quickly to plug our local Frontline network, which is the Leeds Women's Homelessness and Housing Frontline Network. Information for that is on the Frontline Network website. We're just listening to Niamh talk about the shared practice and the existing information that exists around women's homelessness. I think something that's really important, particularly when you're looking at starting any projects or making any changes, is recognizing that there is loads of information out there already. We have a newsletter that you don't have to be local to Leeds to access, where we will do roundups of news in the sector, of events that are coming up. So if anyone would like to kind of keep their finger on the pulse in terms of women's homelessness nationally, then please sign up to that newsletter, and we'd love to have you. So with that, I will move on to some questions, and I think the question I'm going to ask first, which is open to all of our panelists, is around young children entering into temporary accommodation. I think there can be a tendency to focus in on the experiences of women moving through without children, but wondering if there's any good practice examples of temporary accommodation environments that provide supportive environments for young people who've also been exposed to domestic abuse and the trauma associated with that. So I don't know if anyone wants to jump in first. Lisa, if you know of any good practice examples.
Hiya, yeah, so I don't work on the domestic abuse section in our team, but I have been messaging our link person whilst this has been going on. There's nothing much to say other than the refuge that we've got in Leeds does have specialist children and young people workers who are directly supporting children of all ages. Happy to take details, and of the person asking the question, I can get back to you with a bit more information around that. But then we've also got OWL, Our Way Leeds, which is a housing related support services for people aged 16 to 25, and the new burdens money that I described in my presentation, some of that has gone into OWL to give them a specialist domestic abuse worker who will support young people that are coming through that service, really, in terms of their experiences and trauma of domestic abuse.
Fabulous. And Niamh, I wonder if in your kind of overview of the system, whether you found any good practice examples in London or nationally that you might be able to share.
Yeah, so we tend to focus on single homelessness and women who may be parents but not currently residing with their children. So I've got less direct examples, but just generally thinking of TA context. So my background is in domestic abuse and VOG. And generally, yeah, TA would not be the ideal for families. But most refuges do have some sort of provision around children. So often we'll have specialist workers to support children, we'll do workshops and groups and things like that. There's a lot of recognition that that's obviously quite a difficult time for children, a lot of transition, breakdown of relationships, you know, breaks with routine and just their normality and how difficult that is. So yeah, I would say generally refuge is going to have some sort of provision around that, but that will vary obviously in its local context. Yeah, I will have a look. If there's anything I think of afterwards, I can send it round as well.
Yes, thank you. And I think just to touch on our experiences, again, we focus primarily on those moving through the system as single homeless applicants. But what we have seen is with pressure on the local authority, women in our Housing First programme given accommodation with an extra bedroom, so that there is a view of returning contact with the child over time, rather than just putting somebody into a single bed accommodation and then saying, well, you haven't got room for the child, so we can't look at moving the child back into your care. That can be really, really challenging to push for, but it can be really beneficial for everybody if successful. So I'm going to touch now on a question that was asked around menopause, and I know, Emilia, you mentioned menopause as a potentially adverse life experience, particularly for women leaving prison. I wonder if anyone had anything to add about experiences of supporting women who are moving through homelessness systems while they're also going through menopause, and why it is that that's an important consideration for us in the homelessness sector.
I think I just wanted to add that one of the reasons why I did put menopause as one of those things that women experience is because it is something that most women experience rather than men do, and it can become really challenging once you're kind of going through that. And it's something that we're noticing a lot in the prison. There's a lot of women raising the issues of going through menopause. So Together Women in our Women's Centre, we're really trying to support women who are going through menopause, because prisons are not very trauma-informed space, and so it's not a very comfortable place to be when you're experiencing menopause. So I don't know necessarily from kind of like a more housing in the community perspective, but that's just my experience from working with women in prison going through menopause.
Thank you, Emilia. And I think it ties in with that wider theme of gender-informed practice, of not just assuming that all women's experiences are a particular way, and that women are going to have additional things that they're dealing with alongside homelessness that need to be considered when you're designing services. So thank you. Quickly, I'll touch on the final question that's in the chat at the moment, which is around information on somewhere safe to stay and somewhere safe to live. Emilia and Lisa, I know that you both touched on this in your discussions. Are there additional resources at the moment that we can share with people, or is there space for those to be developed?
I can ask my colleagues at Together Women who are managing the Somewhere Safe to Live project. I can ask them if they've got any resources that I can hand out. I don't personally have access to those at the minute. I'm not sure if you, Lisa, have anything from the Leeds perspective.
I don't think we have resources as such, and it'd be great to know a bit more kind of what kind of things that you want to know about and what information we can give you. I mean, I'm happy to give out my email address and people can contact me directly. I mean, both fairly new schemes, they've both been DULUP funded, they're both quite sort of short-term, 2 or 3 years funded at the moment. The Somewhere Safe to Stay has only been open 6 months. We've done fairly well in terms of that, in terms of where the women have moved on to. The majority are moving on into longer term supported housing, which is what you would expect to see really from emergency accommodation. 90% of those moves have been planned and positive. We tend to sort of have around women staying anything between 1 night. We've had women staying up to 6 months. Ideally, we want the women to be moving on after 3 months. Average length of time they're staying is about 19 days. And it is housing all of our most complex needs women. So the staff there that are on board, female only staff, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. We have security there as well. And the majority of the women that we're seeing in the Somewhere Safe to Stay tend to be 80 to 90% survivors of domestic abuse, sex working, have had children removed from their care, have long-standing trauma. So we need that multi-agency wraparound approach in that accommodation really to support people. But yeah, we've had quite a few names that, you know, we tend to have seen over the years that have yo-yoed between accommodation that have managed to stay for a good period of time. So that's great. And then the Somewhere Safe to Live is going to be the move on accommodation for that. So 1-bedroom accommodation, dispersed units in the community that are attached with quite intensive support from Together Women. And again, still very early stages. So we've got our second property that came online last week with that one. But I'm happy to answer questions outside of here.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Lisa. I just wanted to touch on something that Maria put in the chat, which was the particular complexities that are built up for women experiencing homelessness. Maria's highlighted an example of sex workers who use substances and also experience domestic abuse. I'm sure all of us on the panel can relate to the difficulties of trying to access support that will meet the needs of women who are sex working, who are using substances, who are engaging in abusive relationships, and that often there are streams of support that will support one aspect of that but won't cut across. So I wanted to highlight Maria's example of the We Are With You as a drop-in for people to receive scripts, mental health support, link in with police and kind of look at reporting crime that's committed against them. There are so many good examples of small projects across the country who are running on shoestring budgets with frontline workers who are expected to offer any stream of support at any given time. And I think the more that we can show the links between these organisations and the good work that's being done nationally, the more that we can advocate for system change at a higher level and at a policy level. So we have 10 minutes left. I've been scribbling down questions, so we do have time for more questions if anyone has them. I was scribbling down questions as people spoke. I'm glad to say that most of you kind of answered your questions as you then went along, but I want to put a question to everybody on the panel, which is that if you had one thing that you could change, if you could overnight fix something for women experiencing homelessness, what would it be? What would your one wish be for system change or for a little practical thing that people could do differently? So we'll move in order that we came through the speakers. So Emilia, I'm going to pick on you first. Apologies. Yeah, what would your one wish be?
No worries. I think, as my presentation was centered around accessing safe and suitable accommodation for women, I do really think that's one of the biggest barriers that women are facing in order to kind of getting accommodated once they leave prison, especially the women that I work with. So I think my wish would really be, and I know it's, you know, it's hard in a time where there's a housing crisis, there's not a lot of money available, but just more housing options available for women that are very gender specific, a little bit like Somewhere Safe to Live or the community cabin, like I mentioned, just more projects like that being able to be kind of exist and support women. I think that would be my wish.
Yes, thank you, Emilia. Lisa, I'm going to move across to yourself.
I guess two things for me would be better partnerships between housing and criminal justice systems. So I think we've touched on this in a few of the presentations, and we've currently got examples of two women that were staying in the emergency accommodation provision that lost their bed spaces as a result of going into custody. Together, women with their contacts, with their links, and establishes relationships with HMP Niamh. We're working with those women now, weeks prior to their release date, to try and find and source the accommodation that they want in an area that they want, through the Somewhere Safe to Live. So hopefully they will have a place to call home at the point that they're released from custody. And the second big one, which would be no surprise to anyone, is just better relationships in terms of mental health, really. We would love to, and I think we are starting to work now on thinking about funding streams to look at, like we've done with the domestic abuse funding, to get specialist mental health practitioners based within a lot of our accommodation-based services, which would just absolutely be wonderful.
Yeah, and those challenges with mental health seen across the sector, I think. Niamh, we'll come to yourself.
Yeah, I would second everything that's already been said in terms of mental health and accommodation, definitely. I think for me, I would go with a broader one, that a wider understanding of the different needs and experiences of women, because I think actually that unlocks a lot. And I think some of the difficulties around system change is the idea that the status quo is fine, it works for everyone, and women just rust deep in far lesser numbers. And I think really challenging those narratives are what unlocks everything else. It enables you to campaign for more funding, for more projects, all the rest of it. So that would be, yeah, on a broader level.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. And so we'll ask one final question before we close today. Given that this is a frontline workers network, and given that a lot of the people in the audience are going to be coming from a frontline perspective and maybe wondering how you can even start to make change at a system level, what would be your piece of advice if you were speaking to a frontline worker, or yourself, either Emilia, you're on the front line now, or I know others of us have frontline experience, if you could offer a piece of advice for somebody working on the front line who wants to start making change for women, what would it be? Which is a big question, and I will go back the way in the interest of equality and come to you first, Niamh.
I think just recognise that you have a lot of valuable stuff to input into it, and look for forums or projects in your area that are working on a strategic level. Much of what we have done in terms of the strategy and evidence, in terms of stakeholders, obviously frontline workers are the biggest group of stakeholders. They are the majority of people, and they're working on the front line, and yeah, just their views and opinions are so valuable, and to not get disheartened. It's not, I think also recognise what your role is. It's not your role to change it, and I think it can be really disheartening if you're trying to do that, but to work with others and realise that collaboratively change is possible, but to make sure you access those kind of resources and forums and share your views.
Lovely. Lisa, I'll come to you next.
Frontline, really, just don't underestimate your influence. Don't hold back, you know, speak up, say what you can see, lead by example, and anything that you're doing, even though it might seem like a small thing, you know, if you are, you know, being innovative and you are thinking outside of the box and you are doing something different, and that is bringing about change, then other people will see that. So lead by example, shout about it.
Fabulous. Emilia?
Yeah, I just really want to echo what has already been said. I think it's really important to, well, for me anyway, I've really appreciated being able to advocate for the women that I do work with and be able to attend our Leeds with Women's Housing and Homelessness Frontline Network and be able to share the experiences from myself in the frontline, but also the issues that a lot of the women are facing in prison also. So there's a lot that can be done if we all work together and just try and make better changes as a team.
Fabulous. And I think when I look back on my career and starting out as a frontline worker, I think trying to reassure myself and others in the audience about challenging people, about the fact that the first decision, the first option isn't always going to be the best for women that you're working with, and actually sticking your neck out a little and making challenges to advocate for the women that you're working with, which I'm sure you'll all be doing anyway, but kind of holding fire within yourself that is the right thing to be doing, and accessing support from your higher ups where you can. Yeah, it is a vulnerable position being a frontline worker, particularly when it feels like you're fighting against a system that is discriminating against somebody, and it's just you and the person that you're working with kind of putting the boxing gloves on. Work with your managers, work with the people around you, access other lines of support. If you are thinking it, you are not the only person feeling it. And it's very rare that something that you look at and say, this feels discriminatory, you're not going to be the first person to think that. So look across your networks, look across your colleagues, try and join together and draw lines between where those practices are happening to multiple people. Because if you can show, rather than just saying this happened badly in this case, if you can show here is a pattern of discrimination towards women, that's where you start being able to push for systems change from a strategic level. So with that, a call for revolution, and I think that is time for us to close. So thank you very much to everybody who's attended. Like we've said, resources will be made available to people, and our contact details will be shared in the resources as well. Please sign up to the Leeds Women's Homelessness and Housing Frontline Network newsletter. If you are anywhere near Leeds, feel free to come along, and yes, take care, enjoy the rest of your day. I'm really looking forward to the afternoon of really insightful speakers. So thank you to our panel, thank you to everyone in the audience.